Welcome in, welcome in. So let's talk Michigan football. Got a lot to get through, a lot of things I wanted to touch on in regards to Michigan football. I like a lot of these articles from the Wolverine Digest. You have to be careful with these articles, though, because these are Michigan fans talking about this. Michigan fans always have a bias. I know I'm a fan of Michigan, too, so I don't want to sound hypocritical. But it's like what is that theory in psychology? If you like something, if you like someone, you find evidence to back it up. So I've got a bias towards Michigan, the Wolverine Digest. But I see where they're coming from with this article, and I do agree. I do agree. Their whole point in this article, it's a huge mistake to overlook the Wolverines in 2024. That's true. I would not overlook the Michigan Wolverines. Shoot, excuse me. I got to plug in my laptop. Alrighty, so we got the laptop plugged in now. I like this take that they said not to overlook Michigan. Interesting with Michigan is they have one returning starter on offense. That lone returning starter is a pretty good one in Colston Loveland. Defensively, though, their main case, why not to overlook Michigan? Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Will Johnson back, Ernest Hausman's back, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore back. You get the transfer Jay Sean Barnum. This is a perfect article. If you want to stay pessimistic, if you want to look at glass half empty, this is a perfect article. I always like to look at both sides of the article. Even though I agree, don't overlook the Michigan Wolverines. That's what their whole headline is about. I've always been a person to look both sides of the argument. So if you want to be pessimistic for Michigan, then you would say, yes, they do have difference makers back. Yes, they do potentially have 4 first-round NFL draft picks. But also that the team has to take a hit losing 10 offensive starters. I was searching for that comparison for this Michigan football team to a past college team coming off the national championship. I still believe that the perfect comparison is comparing Alabama from 2009 to 2010. If you remember, it was kind of the opposite scenario. Alabama had about 2 returning starters. One of those was Dante Hightower, a first-round NFL difference maker. But they did return Mark Ingram, Julio Jones, 2 different. So essentially, at least 3 difference makers. That's the thing with Michigan. You can't debate. Michigan has at least 3 true difference makers. Kenneth Grant's debatable. Donovan Edwards is debatable just because he hasn't been consistent. But you can't debate Loveland, Mason Graham, and Will Johnson. So that's where it's similar. This team is similar to the 2010 Alabama team. And Alabama lost 3 games. I forget exactly who they played that year. I'm all for interesting. That's why I'm excited for Michigan football this year. To see them follow up another good season potentially. But I'm all for just interesting scenarios playing out. This has the case to be an interesting scenario. Or I should say, this is an interesting scenario. 1 returning starter on offense, and that 1 returning starter happens to be the best tight end in college football. Just a few guys, not a lot of guys back on defense, but the guys back on defense, some of them are pretty darn good. Some of them have experience. So I'm all for interesting, and interesting is exactly what we got going on here. This article makes a good point. Ohio State and Oregon getting a lot of the hype. Rightfully so. I can see Oregon winning the Big Ten. Oregon, to me, is Oregon is going to be legitimately good next year. Oregon's going to be good, I should say. Question is how good. People could argue they might take a step back just because they do lose Bo Nix. This is kind of an article if you want to take a glimpse into the past. Top 5 offensive linemen under Jim Harbaugh. Number 1, Zach Zenner. Zach Zenner, tremendous offensive lineman for Michigan. Zenner, high-level football these past couple years especially. This year got hurt in the Ohio State game. The Michigan team kind of rallied around that. Zach Zenner, just a tremendous football player. Really made an impact for Michigan and deserving of the number 1 spot. Oluwatimi, really good football player as well. Remember, he was a transfer from Virginia. Such a critical factor in why their offensive line won the Remington Award for Best Offensive Line in 2022. Ben Bredesen. Bredesen was there from 2016 to 2019. Andrew Stuber, number 4. Number 5, Trevor Keegan. Really good offensive lineman. That's what Jim Harbaugh has really hung his hat on for a long time. Developing good offensive linemen. Look at running backs. Blake Corum, number 1. Hassan Haskins, number 2. Karan Higdon, number 3. Higdon with a nice career at Michigan. Donovan Edwards. They talk about in this article, Donovan Edwards, this year's key. Donovan Edwards, if he has a big year this year, may move up. Has a chance to move up to 3, 2, or 1. He's listed as 4th. And then Davion Smith. Davion Smith, nice power back. Had a nice career at Michigan. And here's the top 5 wide receivers from the Jim Harbaugh era. Ronnie Bell, number 1. I don't know if I would have had Ronnie Bell, number 1. Roman Wilson, number 2. I probably would have had Roman Wilson, number 1. Just the season Roman Wilson had. Roman Wilson last year, you could argue, was the most underrated player on the Michigan team. Quietly, a really, really good season. Amara Darboh, number 3. Darboh, nice career at Michigan. Was there 2012 to 2016. Nico Collins. The one thing he hits on with Nico Collins, they wish Nico Collins stayed another year, but 2017 to 2019, he was a really good player. Cornelius Johnson. Cornelius Johnson showed up in big moments. That was the name. That's what really Cornelius Johnson really made a name for himself at Michigan with, just showing up in big-time games. We'll do the tight ends as well. Jake Butt, number 1. Colston Loveland, number 2. Luke Schoonmaker, number 3. Schoonmaker, you could argue, it's good to see him get some love. You could argue he was the most underrated player on Michigan football the last few years. Khalid Hill, and then Zach Gentry. The article talks about how people forget Zach Gentry came as a quarterback recruit. So just wanted to share that. I thought that was interesting. Sorry, I got a lot of tabs open. A lot of what I'm hearing is Alex Orji should be the guy. I think he'll win the job. I hope you hear good things about Alex Orji. I think as you go along, I think you want it. I think it makes people nervous that Alex Orji didn't wow people in the spring game. And that doesn't mean you should sound the alarms, but if he's not running away with the job now, what makes things, like if you want to stay pessimistic, what makes you think things are going to change in the fall? Like, is he going to run away with it in the fall? So hopefully in fall camp, hopefully he has a really good fall camp and Orji runs away with it. There's another article they were talking about what's going to be tough for going against Texas, Oregon, USC, Ohio State, some of Michigan's toughest opponents. They're talking about how Texas is going to be tough. Texas is going to be tough because of Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers, guy that can legitimately swing it around the yard. There's going to be Heisman. He's going to be a Heisman, one of the favorites. And Texas is just a good football team, too. And then Oregon. Oregon quietly just keeps getting better. Dan Lanning's one of those guys who just, I want to say quietly works. You could argue it's not so quietly. He's a guy that just seems to know how to build it the right way. Like he keeps working the transfer portal. He keeps getting good players in. Dylan Gabriel. They bring in Evan Stewart, Trayshawn Holden, Evan Stewart from Texas A&M. And they're doing good in recruiting. I guess why I'm buying Oregon and why I think they'll be a tough opponent for Michigan is because when you work hard and you continue to do the right things like Dan Lanning does, he was a defensive coordinator in Georgia. When you continue to work hard, do the right thing, at some point it's going to take off. Is next year the year it takes off for Oregon? That's my question. So that's why I think Oregon would love to see Michigan repeat and win the Big Ten. But that's why if I had to lean, I would lean Oregon because Oregon has legit talent, a good coach, and they just keep building and building. Some would argue they did lose Bo Nix, their quarterback, but they're doing all the right things to get better. So that's why I'm buying Oregon. I'm buying that next year, 2024, is the year where it all clicks for Oregon. This happens from time to time. People forget about this. Just because a team loses a really good quarterback, a lot of times people assume they're not going to be as good. Sometimes that's not always the case. Dylan Gabriel, people forget, is a very good football player. And with the transfer they've landed and what they've done in recruiting, and just the fact that Dan Lanning's a good football coach, it could all come into place for Oregon, and Oregon could be the toughest opponent for Michigan next year. Texas will be tough too. Texas worked the transfer portal as well. Andrew Makuba, safety that was at Clemson. They got Isaiah Bond, receiver that was at Alabama. Texas can be tough. It's going to be a tough matchup, certainly for Michigan. USC, too. USC is definitely... It's interesting with USC. They still have good players, and they're bringing a new defensive coordinator. Same thing with Dan Lanning. Lincoln Riley's a good football coach. You want to make the case. USC could easily look like the 2022 USC, and if they are, Michigan's in trouble. Washington, too, is another team. Washington, USC, Oregon are all similar in a way, or similar in ways. Bring in a lot of transfers. Washington does have a new coach, but he is a good coach. So they also have a good coach like Oregon and USC. And also, Washington has recruited well. So, I'm going to look up where Washington finished in recruiting. Under Kalen DeBoer, certainly well. I guess they were only 30th for this incoming class. But in 2023, 29th. It just shows what a good football coach Kalen DeBoer is. 59th overall recruiting class in 2022. Chris Peterson started bringing in some really good classes to Washington. Michigan's win total 6 at 9.5. That's a very good estimate for Vegas. Because if you look, one article makes a point, Michigan has most likely 5, they put it in their terms, losable games. At worst case, if you're a betting man, if you're playing it safe, I would guess Michigan wins 7 to 9 games. I know that's a wide range, so that's not a great prediction. That's not a very sound prediction. But it's a safe prediction in the sense it's hard to see Michigan losing more than 5 games, but it's also hard to see them winning more than 9 games. So the 9.5 win total seems about right. I keep saying 9-3. I would love to see 12-0, but 9-3 in this schedule is no slouch. They said 5 losable games. That's what's tough for Michigan, Texas, Oregon, Washington, USC. Odds tell you, Ohio State, odds tell you that 1 or 2 of those games, they're just going to have they could likely be the better team and have a bad day. That's what's really, If you want to boil it down to why a tough schedule is so tough, even if you are the better team, if you're playing 5, 6 really good opponents, odds are you're just going to have at least one bad day. Look at Alabama in 2015. That team actually lost a game, as loaded as they were. They just happened to have a bad day against a good team, Ole Miss. Ole Miss wasn't a great team, but they were a good team, and they happened to have a bad day. I think if you want to back up the criticism Michigan got for their schedule the last 2 years, is Michigan had a bad day, like in 2022 against Illinois, and still found a way to win the football game. So that's what's tough for Michigan is, on paper, you can make these arguments, especially as a Michigan, you can make the arguments that Michigan is a better team, will be a better team next year than Texas. They will be a better team than Oregon, a better team than Washington, a better team than USC. But they still have to go out and play. And odds tell you that one of those days could be a bad day. Maybe it's week 2 against Texas. It's a bad day. I believe that Texas is a win, don't necessarily want to call it a must win, but it's a huge momentum building win. It's a game, if they lose, the critics will have some fun with it. And what I mean by that is people will be, Michigan, tough schedule. Look at easy schedule the last 2 years. Now they play Texas, a tough out-of-conference team week 2, and they lose it. So the critics will have fun with that if Michigan loses. But if they win, huge momentum builder. Huge momentum builder in the sense, beat Fresno State, you beat Texas. Arkansas State should be a win. Now you're 3-0. Now USC's coming to town, and you might be, depending on if USC gets upset, you might be double-digit favorites. Then suddenly you're 4-0, and you got Minnesota, and you're 5-0, and then you travel to Washington. Not an easy place to win, but you're 5-0, your head's hanging high, and it's a different scenario as opposed to 4-1. Maybe you beat USC, but you lost to Texas. Now you're heading to Washington, a tough place to play, like I mentioned, with a little bit of doubt. They're talking if this is the last year for Ryan Day if Michigan beats them. If Michigan were to go to Columbus and beat Ohio State, is that it for Ryan Day? It's an interesting question to pose, but it's a tough question to answer. Because if Ryan Day goes 11-1, the one loss into Michigan, who wants to be the guy that fires a guy who goes 11-1, even though he's lost to Michigan 4 years in a row? That's a tough decision to make. That's the thing about life. A lot of times life can come down to making tough decisions. That's a decision for some Ohio State fans. The choice could be easy. Lost to Michigan 4 years in a row. Yep, got to get rid of him. That's easy for a fan to say. But if you're the Ohio State athletic department, you're saying, man, we just went 11-1 again, and we did lose to Michigan, but we're really going to fire this guy? It's a tough question, but it's an interesting question to ask yourself, especially at this point in time when the season hasn't even started. They announced the Michigan representatives, Big Ten Media Days. Donovan Edwards, Makari Page, Max Bredesen, 3 good football players. Edwards, the running back. Page, the safety. Max Bredesen, the fullback. I made the case that Makari Page may be the most underrated player on the Michigan football team. I always like to give credit to underrated guys. The stars get a lot of the credit, as deservingly so. I've went on and on about Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Colston Loveland. Then we've talked about Donovan Edwards a lot. But I've always been a guy that likes to give credit to the under the radar guys, the unsung heroes. That's what Makari Page is. He is an under the radar guy. Does Michigan win a national championship without Makari Page last year? Maybe. But having Makari Page certainly was a luxury. And Makari Page is one of those guys, I'm sure if you ask Michigan football players, it'd be like, that dude's tough. That dude's a good football player, and he really helps our football team. That's what's cool about when I played sports. There was always guys who maybe they weren't well known in the conference, guys I played football with, but they were a guy that having them on your team, you're like, you knew that they were a really good player and they were a huge asset to your team. Makari Page is that type of guy for Michigan. You know what this guy means to Michigan football. The players on Michigan know. Tough, hard-hitting safety. Really like his game, and he's certainly deserving to take the stage and speak. And I'm excited to hear what he has to say. Donovan Edwards. Sound like Donovan Edwards is working hard in the offseason. That's the hope. You hope you get Donovan Edwards, the 2022 version. Big runs, big plays. A lot of excitement for Donovan Edwards. Here's an article. Former Ohio State player has another terrible take on Michigan football. This is by the Wolverines. What did someone say? Michigan is going to have the biggest Buckeye scoops. Michigan going to have the biggest drop-off in college football history. Well, that was the Buckeye Scoop that said that. So the Buckeye Scoop that said this about Michigan, biggest. They made points here arguing that Michigan's going to have the biggest drop-off in college football. Number 1 saying no more cheating. Number 2 saying star players transfer, left for draft. Super seniors graduated, coaches left. That does tie in with, if you want to stay Michigan fans, and rightfully so, will always make the case for Michigan to have another really good season. Let me check and make sure my camera's recording here. Michigan will always make the case. Michigan fans will always make a case that Michigan's going to have another really good season. I had one Michigan fan comment they're going back-to-back national championships. And why not say stuff like that? I always like to hear both sides of the argument, and this is both sides of the argument. There is a case Michigan could have a drop-off. I would argue if we do see the drop-off in Michigan football, it's it's either next year or 2026. 2026 is going to say a lot about this Michigan program under the direction of Sharon Moore. 2026 is a long ways away, but time goes by fast. And I believe that's when you'll really get a grasp of what this Michigan program looks like. Let's play this game. What if Michigan does drop off, though? It would be interesting. Then in 2025, I believe Moore wouldn't be on the hot seat. This is all hypothetically. But then that puts a lot of pressure on Michigan's coaching staff in 2025 in the Michigan football program. So here's 24/7 Sports, an article I like, just talking about the Michigan Wolverines depth chart. It says when I talk about Orji should be the guy. I think if Orji's the guy, I think a lot of people want Orji to be the guy because that's the most comforting. I outlined this before with Alex Orji. A lot of times when you're scouting, I took a scouting class, the NFL Scouting Academy. A lot of scouting is predicting the future. And predicting the future, to predict the future, you have to go with what we know. What we know is Orji's a guy that's gotten better, workout fanatic, 3-star guy. Sounds like he's got a chip on his shoulder. Coaching staff trusted him to put him in the game in a big-time situation against Ohio State. And he has legit running ability. And he solid throwing ability. He has at least solid arm strength. Those are all things we know about Alex Orji. So we know some positive things about Alex Orji, and we know coaches' trust. So if he is the starter, that backs up our the belief, or that backs up that it's comforting for fans to know that what we saw is true to an extent. So I believe Alex Orji being the guy would give Michigan fans some comfort. Sounds like Davis Warren is going to push for the job too. Still got Jack Tuttle. Michigan, I would assume, it's Sharon Moore's program. I would assume they want to go with one guy. Maybe they do play the two. Maybe they try to do two guys. Alex Orji. 24/7 projects Orji to be the guy. Davis Warren, the backup. Jack Tuttle, Jaden Denigal, Jaden Davis. Can't forget about Jaden Davis. Jaden Davis, very talented guy as well. Might have a ways to go since he's only a true freshman, but a talented guy nonetheless. Here, 24/7 says it. The Wolverines want Orji to take this job running away. That's what it sounds like. From Michigan fans, I always like to hear Michigan fans. That's what a lot of your guys' comments is. You want Alex Orji. My guess is a lot of Michigan fans want Alex Orji because they heard Orji. If it wasn't McCarthy last year, then Orji would have been the guy. A lot of times based on that logic, that's what really propels fans to root for that guy to win the job. If you rewind to the spring prior to the 2023 season, I remember in the 2023 spring game a year ago, Orji looked pretty good too. There was even a video, a guy that does highlights on YouTube put J.J. McCarthy should be on alert. I didn't watch the Michigan spring game. It sounded like Orji didn't look as good in this spring. McCarthy, people forget, McCarthy didn't have a great spring game either. But Orji's a guy that's jacked. He's shredded. Being in good shape isn't everything to having success in football at quarterback. It says a lot, though, about his dedication to hard work, though. 24/7 Sports here they're arguing that Orji may not be head and shoulders above the rest of the quarterbacks in the room, but his talent is. See, in my opinion, I'm not ready to say that his talent is head and shoulders above the rest, but it might be. The reason I say it might be, and I can't say that definitively, just because I haven't seen him throw the ball enough. I haven't seen him play enough. I saw him run the ball against Ohio State. That's why I go back to that's why I go back to going off of what we've seen. The coach is trusted to put him in a big game. He's a legit runner, and he can run with some physicality. Those are all things that I've seen. That's the other thing that with scouting, you're trying to predict the future, and you have to go by what you've seen, what a guy can do. That's like a thing about scouting. What can a guy do? What level can he do it at? We know Orji's a runner. He's He's good at breaking tackles. Can run physically. Those are things he can do. He's fast. He's got good bursts. Those are things he can do. So making predictions. So scouting. A lot of scouting is knowing what a guy can do and seeing it. So we've seen Alex Orji be a good runner. We know he can be a good runner. He does have good arm strength too. His release is a little elongated. Not the most fluid release, but it looks like he can throw the ball downfield. I went back to some of his high school tape. Jaden Davis, I like his ability to throw on the run. Accuracy. So 24/7, based on what 24/7 is saying, it sounds like it's down to Orji and Davis Warren. Jack Tuttle, Jaden Denigal, Jaden Davis. Running back, Donovan Edwards, Khalil Mullins. Khalil Mullins, Donovan Edwards, always at the top of the list just because, once again, what we know is Donovan Edwards is capable of being a really good pass catcher, creating big plays, showing big speed, showing big-time speed, big-time plays in big-time games. Khalil Mullins, experience, power, made a critical play in a big-time game. Those are things we know about Donovan Edwards and Khalil Mullins. Benjamin Hall's got some playing time. Tavier Dunlap. Cole Cabana, guy to keep an eye on. Legit speedster. Jordan Marshall. I apologize. I'm not sure his story. Is he an incoming freshman? He's a freshman running back they landed. He's going to be a freshman this 4-star. He's a guy I just wasn't familiar with. Micah Capana. Like Cole Cabana. Cole Cabana, I've said before, I watched him play in high school. Good speed, good receiver. Similar skill set to Donovan Edwards. Receiver Tyler Morris, Samaj Morgan, Frederick Moore, C.J. Charleston, Amarion Walker. Those are both guys they got in the transfer portal, Charleston and Walker. Kendrick Bell, Channing Goodwin, Amarion Stewart. Quietly some depth at wide receiver. Same thing with tight end. Quietly some depth. Wide receiver is an interesting core for Michigan. It's not Tyler Moore, Samaj Moore. 3 guys, you read their names and you don't go wow. But when you look closer, Frederick Moore, Tyler Morris, capable of being good players, and Samaj Morgan made an impact as a freshman. And they talk about what this guy can do after the catch. Tyler Morris made the big play, the sideline 34-yard catch against Alabama. So Morris showed up in a big game. Samaj Morgan, electric after the catch with some return ability. Then Frederick Moore could be good for him. Charleston, Walker. So Michigan quietly with some depth at wide receiver. Tight end, quietly really good depth. Loveland, Marlon Klein, Zach Marshall, Deacon Tonelli, Braden Prescorn, guy I watched him closely in high school, not in person, but his tape. Hogan Hansen. The offensive line. Miles Hinton, Giovanni El-Hadi, Greg Crippen, Josh Preeb, Andrew Gentry. Good football players. Miles Hinton, good football player. Giovanni El-Hadi, think maybe the best player on this offensive line. I like El-Hadi. He did a good job in the snaps he got last year. Crippen at center, going to have to live up to the hype of the very talented centers they had the last couple years in Oluwatimi, followed by Drake Nugent last year. Jeffrey Percy, Raheem Anderson, Nathan Ifobi, Evan Link, Dominique Gaitis. The offensive line, for some reason, always, I look at it with concern at first, but when you look into it more, you start to get more, becomes more comforting. You think Miles Hinton, experience at Stanford, experience last year. Giovanni El-Hadi, experience last year. Greg Crippen, well, Michigan just finds a way to get good play out of the centers. Josh Preeb, experience, transfer, comes over from Northwestern, I believe. Yep, comes over from Northwestern. And then Andrew Gentry, guy that's been in the program for a few years now. 4-star recruit. So Michigan, the offensive, you look at it, and you raise a little bit of concern, but then you look more into it, and you get a little bit more comfortable. I like how 24/7 Sports puts it. We think Michigan will be fine and very good in the offensive line. I think that sums it up simply. We think Michigan will be fine. I guess another way to pose it is, how can they be bad? You could argue Michigan's offensive line may only be solid next year. It's very difficult knowing, if you know that all these guys stay healthy, Miles Hinton, El-Hadi, Greg Crippen, Josh Preeb, Andrew Gentry, it's very hard to believe their offensive line could be bad or even below average if all those guys stay healthy. But you never know. They're speaking highly of Kenneth Grant. Really nice play made against Washington. Track down the ball carrier. Kenneth Grant could quietly be Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Colson Loveland, the three best players on Michigan. But Kenneth Grant and Donovan Edwards, those two guys are the ultimate X factor, and by that I mean if they have a big-time season, that is just so critical for Michigan. I talk about how the win total's spot on. Good seasons from Will Johnson, Mason Graham, and Colston Loveland. That's probably good enough to get them 9 wins. But if Michigan wants to do something special, if someone comes from the future and they tell us that Michigan, maybe they don't go 12-0, but they go 11-1, 10-2, and win the Big Ten, beat Ohio State. I think it's fair to assume that Kenneth Grant and Donovan Edwards had really good seasons. So the point I'm trying to make is if Michigan wants to have another really good season, capped off by a Big Ten championship, a win against Ohio State, in a playoff berth, and maybe a repeat national championship, you would most likely assume that Kenneth Grant and Donovan Edwards showed up big, and they were consistent. Because some people have corrected me. Everyone likes my take that I just go on. Everyone likes that I go on and on about Will Johnson, Mason Graham, and Colston Loveland, because I love these three guys. Absolutely love Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Colston Loveland. Consistent, big-time players for Michigan football. But a lot of people have respectfully told me, you should add Donovan Edwards to that list. Then some people have said, add Kenneth Grant. One of my buddies said, add Kenneth Grant to that list. And I thought about it, and okay. The reason I like talking about Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Colston Loveland so much, people always say there's no such thing as a sure thing, whether that's anything. Tomorrow it's I don't believe there's a chance of rain. Could it rain? Sure. There's no guarantee. Tomorrow it's supposed to be sunny, but there's no guarantee it could be sunny, even though it says that. I believe why I keep talking about Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Colston Loveland, they're as close to sure things as you're going to get. When a guy's heralded prior to a season, when he's heralded at the number one position for the next upcoming draft, there's a reason for that. There's a reason Will Johnson's ranked, given the 96 overall, highest grade of any player in NCAA football. There's a reason NFL mock drafts, early, mind you, have Will Johnson going third overall. There's a reason Mason Graham's a top 10 player by the consensus board. There's a reason most people are considering Colston Loveland the number one consensus tight end. There's a reason people last year were saying outside of Brock Bowers, he's the best tight end in college football. So that's why I keep hammering those guys home. They're as close to sure things as there is. Grant, a reserve last year, going to be a starter this year. That's what they're talking about in this article. This reminds me, watching Kenneth Grant, a play where he dominated the Washington offensive lineman, or at least got the better of him. That reminds me of how dominant Michigan was against Washington. Greg McElroy leaves Michigan out of the top 10 in college football preseason rankings. Once again, this goes back to that tweet by the said it was a former Ohio State player. I'm not familiar with the guy's name. Must have been a guy that played at Ohio State years ago because I'm not too familiar. But anyway, this goes back to Greg McElroy has Ohio State 1, Georgia 2, Oregon 3. There's the Oregon hype. Is Michigan at 11. This goes back to Greg McElroy, not a Michigan fan. He says a lot of people are going to lose their minds here, and I understand that. And look at it. This is quotes from Greg McElroy here. Quote, a lot of people are going to lose their minds here. I understand that. Quote, I look at a team the last couple of years, I've been high on Michigan. He said in the latest, always college football, I picked them to win the national championship, understandably because of the continuity. So they just don't have as many pieces. Yeah, so that's why I always like to hear the opinions of people that are not Michigan fans. in life, a lot of times people, if you like someone, you tend to notice the good qualities in them. Greg McElroy is not a Michigan fan, so he's not looking for he's not constantly, Michigan fans do that, and there's nothing wrong with this. He's not constantly looking for proof to back up that Michigan's going to repeat. So I respect that. And he has a point. Michigan does lose a lot of pieces. That has to account for something. There's both sides to this argument. There's a side that Michigan has enough studs coming back that they can overcome the mass loss. But there is also, and you can overcome that, but there is evidence, the Alabama 2010 team. Obviously, that's a completely different team, but it's a similar scenario. So it backs up my point to an extent, I believe, that when you do lose, in the case of Michigan losing 10 starters on offense, Alabama from 2009 to 2010 lost 9 starters, returned just 2 on defense. When you lose that many starters, it has to affect you in some way. That's what I think Greg McElroy is getting at. He also says Michigan's defense won't be to the level of last year. Sure. I don't think they have as much depth certainly on defense and offense as well. He's talking about the question at quarterback. Massive question marks at quarterback. I wouldn't say it's I don't necessarily agree it's a massive question mark. I think it is a question mark. He makes a good point here. If you're playing SC, you might have to score more points. This kind of backs up my point about Michigan stumbling and losing against Oregon, USC, Texas. What are the odds that they are going to... Odds are they're going to have a down offensive day against one of those opponents. Oregon, USC, Washington, Texas, Ohio State. Just odds tell you that they're not going to be firing on all cylinders offensively in all of those games. That's the point Greg McElroy is trying to make here, because he's saying you have to, against teams like that, score 35 points. Odds are Michigan is not going to score at least 35 points. You could argue that maybe Oregon, USC, Washington won't score that many points either. But it just happens that sometimes you just have an off day. College, it's interesting. We're getting closer. One of those articles kind of made the point, as you get closer, you start to become more confident. I think in a way, I'm growing more confident for this Michigan football team as we get closer. It may not be validated, but rewind to after Michigan wins the national championship and McCarthy, all these guys declare for the NFL. A lot of seniors leave. Harbaugh gone. So there's a string of evidence saying Michigan's just no way they can be as good as next year. It is kind of cool how as we get closer to next season that you start to hear more and more. Mind you, it's from people who are Michigan fans, Wolverine Digest. But it is cool to hear more and more things to help you garner confidence in this upcoming season. Like Donovan Edwards working hard in the weight room, becoming more of a leader. Hope that he's going to look more like the guy in 2022. You hear reassuring, comforting things that the offensive line will be fine. You hear stuff like that, especially from 24/7, a source that has no bias towards Michigan football. So it's cool to hear stuff like that. You start to look at the positives in the wide receiving core, the depth that they have. You start to see the depth at running back too, and not just Donovan Edwards. You see Khalil Mullins is still there, a guy that you see in your mind making that play against Ohio State. So that's cool. It's cool to hear reassuring things that Michigan football has got a chance to be successful. Looking at McElroy's top 10, though, Oregon number 3, Ohio State 1. A lot of people are drinking the Kool-Aid on Ohio State. It's interesting. I predicted Michigan to beat Ohio State, and I've been nervous too, even in 2022, after they won in 2021. Ohio State, Michigan, that game's a long way away. We're a long way from November 2024. But Ohio State, once again, doesn't necessarily scare me. They may be jinxing it. Maybe Travion Henderson runs all over Michigan. Maybe Ohio State's defense. But Ohio State, once again, doesn't necessarily scare me. Interesting with Ohio State, same kind of roster. They're good, but they're not really scaring me. I look at Ohio State. I do see they got Seth McLaughlin from Alabama, good player. Will Howard, the quarterback, good player. The safety from Alabama, Caleb Downs, good player. But I was talking about this before with Ohio State. And Dan Lanning, it's ironic Oregon's joining the Big Ten. Dan Lanning has the quote, good is the enemy of great. I think that quote kind of ties in with Ryan Day in Ohio State. Good is the enemy of great. Jack Sawyer, J.T. Tuimoloau. Two players that were supposed to be great, right? Tuimoloau, number 2 or third-ranked player in the country. They've been good. Sawyer, too, is like the number 5th overall player. They've been good players, but they haven't been great players. Good's the enemy of great. Ohio State's offensive line in the past few years has been good. Defensive line overall, been good. Good is the enemy of great. The problem with Ohio State, let's look at Ohio State's depth chart. I know we're talking Michigan football, but it's important to understand Ohio State's football's depth chart when talking about how Michigan would potentially match up with it. I know it's a long ways away. Ohio State the past few years, similar to what I said, I'm a big fan of sure things, or as close to sure things. Ryan Day's done a good job of that. The sure thing has been with Ohio State, good quarterback play. Not just good quarterback play, elite quarterback play, elite athletes. At least with Justin Fields, elite athletes, elite wide receivers. Those are things that were about as close to a sure thing as possible. Next year, Jeremiah Smith, one of the top players in the nation, number 1 wide receiver, 5-star guy. Emeka Abuka, really good wide receiver. Will Howard may just be a good quarterback. Once again, though, you can guarantee they'll be elite at wide receiver. But the rest of the Ohio State roster, solid, good players. But you're asking, is this another case of good is the enemy of great? Ohio State's going to be good, solid. Coaches always talk about, I think this ties into Ohio State, coaches always talk about when they're trying to be optimistic for a good season. It's kind of a funny joke. They say, we got a lot of returning starters. That's a good thing. But we weren't very good last year, so we got a lot of returning starters. That's a bad thing. So there's people do a lot of men. Greg McElroy, it sounded like that's what he was getting at when he was talking about Ohio State. It's good to use logical information when making a claim. Greg McElroy, I didn't read fully what he said. I assume he's getting at, I guess I shouldn't assume, but a lot of people, when they're saying that Ohio State's going to be a good football team again, they're backing it up based off of they have a lot of guys back. They got transfers. There's going to be elite play at the wide receiver position. It's a good logical argument. But I think why people love football and what people love about college football is logical claims aren't always backed up. That's what people love about sports, the unpredictability. Now, this sounds like I'm saying Ohio State's not going to be very good. This sounds like I'm getting at that Ohio State is not going to be as good as they are on paper. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying with Ohio State is good could be the enemy of great once again for them. They do have as close to a sure thing as elite wide receiver play, but good is, like I keep saying, good is the enemy of great. Is that going to be good enough next year for Ohio State to win the Big Ten and win the national championship? I think it's an interesting question. But I'm going to wrap with that, guys. Thanks for tuning in to the Brand Partial Show. Stay tuned for more episodes and clips from the show. Till next time, peace.